Good morning. Glad to see you guys here. Thanks for coming back. Beautiful day outside. There's not a cloud in the sky. Got to see a sunrise today. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. A little chilly, but I want to welcome you guys here. I want to welcome those that are tuned in on YouTube. Thanks for being here. We're going to continue our discussion on 12 ordinary men. And I have to say, this has been a pretty interesting study for me, and I hope it's been as interesting for you guys. I've tried to convey what I've been reading from this book to you guys and to make this subject interesting, because it's not very often we get to look at each individual apostle and see the type of person they were, the characteristics, their personality. We don't get to do this very often, so I hope it's as interesting for you as it has been for me. And it's kind of a big deal because you don't get to see me up here very often, maybe a week or two. We're going to go through hopefully an entire quarter, so bear with me as we get through this together. This morning we're going to talk about James. But before we get there, I want to kind of do a short review, if we can, over the last few weeks. As we continue our study, I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes just going over the last few weeks. When Jesus came to this earth, he chose from the hundreds of followers or disciples 12 men to help complete his mission, to spread the good news of God's love and forgiveness. You might think this would be an easy task. I mean, obviously, he would need people from the religious establishment, right? I mean, they knew the Old Testament as far as the law. They knew the law, right? They were religious. So you would think that Jesus would choose somebody from the religious establishment, right? Of course not. No. These people rejected Jesus. They rejected his message. In fact, they resented him. In fact, John 1:11 says that his own did not receive him. Even in his home, he wasn't accepted. So Jesus didn't choose a scribe, and he didn't choose a Pharisee, or anybody from the institutionalized Judaism. He chose 12 ordinary men just like you and me, just regular people, regular guys. And choosing these men was a judgment against this Jewish authority. Were these 12 ordinary guys qualified to be apostles? What qualified them? He chose Galileans. Galileans were considered low-class people back in the day. They were considered uneducated, commoners. I mean, they were fishermen. He pulled in a tax collector, an anti-government terrorist. So I just want to remind you guys that these were men just like you and me, because Jesus selected the unworthy. He selected the unworthy and the unqualified to share this message. So he knew what he was doing. These were men that we can relate to. And just a reminder that they had the same attitudes and the same weaknesses that we have, that we deal with in our lives at some point. The first week, we looked at Peter. He was the fearless fisherman who was not afraid to jump in with answers, questions, or even swinging a sword. He was right there. Whenever he felt it necessary, he would be the one to speak up. The apostle with the foot-shaped mouth, right? He had the dominating personality that Jesus could take and mold to help him to be the person that Jesus needed Peter to be. A leader with restraint, a leader with humility and compassion to carry on Jesus' work. Last week we talked briefly about Andrew. Andrew was Peter's brother, and he and Peter were practically inseparable for the most part. In the beginning, Andrew was with John in the wilderness with John the Baptist. So when he first learned about Jesus, hey, the Messiah is here, what was the first thing Andrew did? This is where you guys come in. He went and got Peter. Hey, Peter, we have found the Messiah. So this became Andrew's style of bringing people to Jesus, one person at a time. And we'll note that we remembered, we spoke last week about how he didn't seek recognition. He was not really one that was in the limelight. He preferred to be working in the background, okay? So he didn't seek recognition for all his efforts. He didn't need attention. He just saw the value of individual people. So as we discuss these 12 men, I'm sure we'll find at least one that we can identify with. Each one seems to have a unique personality that we can probably see in ourselves. So let's look at James. Let's spend some time with James today. Remember week 1, I talked about, it seems that the 12 were broken down into 3 groups. And group number 1 included Peter, Andrew, James, and John. James is part of what we'll consider group 1. Of the disciples in Jesus' closest circle, James is probably the least familiar to us. There's not a lot of details about his life and character. He's never a standalone character in the group, as he's usually paired with his brother, James and John. Usually when you see James, it's followed with, and his brother John. In fact, the only time we see him mentioned by himself is when he's martyred, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So this lack of detail may seem ironic because you would think that he would dominate the group, being the oldest of the 2 brothers and being a son of Zebedee. Between the 2 sets of brothers, Peter and Andrew, James and John, the family of James and John seems to have been more prominent than Peter and Andrew. This is evident by how many times they're referred to as the sons of Zebedee, okay? It's mentioned 6 times in the gospel, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of Zebedee. So evidently Zebedee was a man of some importance and most likely quite well-to-do. Apparently his fishing business was large enough to employ multiple hired servants. In Mark chapter 1, when he, Jesus, had gone a little farther, he saw James and his brother John in a boat preparing their nets. Without delay, he called them, and they left their father Zebedee in the boat with hired men. So evidently, he could afford to have hired men more than just his sons. Also, his family had enough status that John was known by the high priest. And we know this because in John chapter 18, this is after Jesus had been arrested. John and Peter are following Jesus. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus because this disciple, meaning John, was known to the high priest. He went with Jesus into the priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was John, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. So he was able to get Peter into the courtyard the night Jesus was arrested. Early church records show that Zebedee was a Levite and closely related to the high priest's family. Either way, he was a man of importance, and his reputation reached as far as Jerusalem from Galilee. James was the elder brother of a prominent family, and he might have considered himself the chief apostle, which could be the reason why there were disputes about which one would be the greatest. The only first that James ever received was martyrdom. So we do see evidence that James was very significant to the group, as he was in the close inner circle of three: Peter, James, and John. You mentioned the three. It's mentioned many times in the Gospels, Peter, James, and John. And here's some things that that James actually witnessed. He was part of the three when Jesus raised Jairus' daughter from the dead. When Jesus brought them in, he did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. And the same group witnessed the transfiguration. In Matthew 17, after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. There he was transfigured before them. And James was also included with Peter and John when Jesus asked them to pray with him in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." Then he took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. So James was privileged to witness the power of raising one from the dead. He witnessed Jesus' glory up on the mountain during the transfiguration, and he was there to witness our Savior's agony in the garden. One word that would apply to the life of James would be passion. That's how we've titled this lesson this morning. This class is James, the Apostle of Passion. From what little we know about him, it is obvious he was a man of intense fervor. In fact, Mark 3:17, when Jesus was calling the apostles, Mark notes that Jesus referred to them as Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. This is the sole location in the Bible that references the names of Zebedee's sons, references them as the sons of thunder. Now, you don't get a nickname like that for no reason. This obviously defined James's personality very vividly. He was zealous, passionate, and possibly even aggressive. He and his brother both would not back away from a confrontation. In fact, they might have looked forward to one, as we'll see here in a little bit. We don't know how many times Jesus employed this nickname for James and John, but Boanerges seems to have been bestowed on them, on the sons of Zebedee, to chide them when their temperament got out of hand. They must have done something to get Jesus' attention to come up with this. I'm sure there's a time and a place in spiritual leadership for thunderous personalities. Would you agree? Possibly. Elijah was that kind of character. as well as Nehemiah. He had a similar passion or zealousness. John the Baptist, I mean, he had a fiery temperament, didn't he? Outspoken in the way he confronted Herod about his brother's wife. So he had a fiery personality as well. So there's nothing wrong with such zeal, except that it could be responsible for losing your head, well, literally, right? Jesus himself even made a whip and cleansed the temple. I mean, his zeal, he could get a fiery temperament when he needed to. But we must be careful, as zeal, apart from knowledge, can be less than righteous. Okay? Zeal without wisdom is dangerous, as Paul noted in Romans. And James sometimes had a tendency to let misguided zeal get the better of him. So let's talk about two incidents regarding James, and his brother was involved, but we're going to focus on James this morning. And this is from Luke 9, starting in verse 51. As the time approached for him to be taken up to heaven, this is Jesus resolutely set out for Jerusalem, and he sent messengers on ahead who went into a Samaritan village to get things ready for him. But the people there did not welcome him because he was headed for Jerusalem. When the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, "Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them?" But Jesus turned and rebuked them, and he and his disciples went to another village. Fire from heaven. Our first glimpse of why James and John were known as the sons of thunder. Let's bring fire from heaven. Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem for the Passover, and he knew that this was going to be his last. In order to get there, he had to pass through Samaria. When he entered a village, they weren't welcome. Now, it's significant that Jesus traveled through Samaria. Even though it's the shortest route from Galilee, most Jews deliberately traveled around Samaria, going many miles out of their way, crossing the Jordan twice, just so they could avoid Samaria. So what was the deal with the Samaritans? A quick history lesson. What do you guys remember about the Samaritans? How come they were so despised? Mixed race? Absolutely. They were a mixed race and offspring. Is this not showing up? Okay. I don't need that right now anyway. They were a mixed race offspring from the northern kingdom of Israel with the Assyrians. The Assyrians conquered them back in 2 Kings, I believe. The land was resettled with pagans and foreigners loyal to Assyria. Now, the Israelites that weren't taken captive, that weren't taken back in exile, that remained, they intermarried with these pagans. Over time, they didn't prosper. The land didn't produce anything. Even lions were killing them. So the king sent a priest back from exile, back over into Samaria, to teach the people about God. In short, this didn't work out, okay? They worshipped whatever gods they wanted. They even built a temple at Mount Gerizim. So the Jews considered the Samaritans a mongrel race with a mongrel religion. because they never really truly worshiped God. So, Jesus takes a direct route from Galilee to Jerusalem through Samaria. He and his followers were refused accommodations. It wasn't that there was no room in the inn. They just were simply being inhospitable. They weren't accepting him. They hated the Jews just as much as the Jews hated them. Of course, Jesus had shown nothing but less than goodwill towards Samaritans. I mean, Jesus healed a Samaritan from leprosy. He spent time with a woman at the well and even followed her into her town, spent a couple of days there evangelizing her neighbors. So he had nothing less than goodwill for the Samaritan. He even made a Samaritan a hero. Remember the Good Samaritan? And now they were showing Jesus contempt. Well, the sons of thunder had an immediate solution, right? They could solve this problem right now by calling fire from heaven. Lord, do you want us to call fire from heaven to destroy them? And some manuscripts actually put in just as Elijah did. This reference to Elijah here was full of significance. James and his brother remembered their history because this region just happened to be where an incident similar to this took place. Long before the Assyrian conquest, in the days of Elijah, Samaria was turned into a center of Baal worship. So we get another history lesson real quick. Gene's Reader's Digest version, okay? It won't take up a lot of time. In 1 Kings, King Ahaziah had fallen and mortally wounded himself. He sent messengers out to inquire of Baal-zebub to see if he would recover from his injuries. An angel informed Elijah, and he intercepted these men on the way and told them that the king would surely die. So they went back to the king and gave him this message, which he didn't receive very well. So what did he do? This enraged the king, so he sent a captain with 50 men out to hunt down Elijah. So they met Elijah on top of a hill, and they said, "Man of God, the king says, come down." They met Elijah's response: "If I am a man of God, may fire come down from heaven and consume you and your 50 men." And it happened. So the king sent another captain and 50 more men. When they approached Elijah, "Man of God, the king has said, come down." And once again, Elijah says, "If I am a man of God, may fire come down and consume you and your 50 men." And it happened. So the king sent yet another captain with 50 men. This captain was either wiser or had been paying attention, but when they found Elijah, he had a little more humility about himself. Bowing and begging for their lives, they asked Elijah if he would come back with them. And he did. Okay. He stuck to his guns and still told the king that he was going to die, and he did. But this is the history of this area in Samaria that James and John happen to remember. So James and John thought they were standing on solid precedent when they suggested fire coming down from heaven. It was a fitting response to the disrespect that they received. Elijah had done it, and he wasn't condemned. If this was a fitting response, do you think Jesus might have done it himself? But But notice that James is so brazen as to say, do you want us to call fire down from heaven? Sons of thunder. Well, Jesus' mission was very different from Elijah's. His response to the Boanerges brothers was a firm rebuke. It says he turned and rebuked them. He must have stopped in his tracks, turned around, and gave them the eye. But he rebuked them. And this late in Jesus' ministry, you might think that they would have a different attitude too. I mean, this was right before the Passover. This was very close to Jesus' death, at the end of his teachings. So what did they do? They just went to another village. Evidently, this village accepted them. They found their accommodations elsewhere. And when we get to Philip, I'm sure we're going to read about how he preached to the Samaritans. Now, this is important because Philip preached to the Samaritans and many were saved. Imagine if James had gotten his way and had these people annihilated. So aren't we grateful for the patience of God? Yeah. Okay, thrones in the kingdom. We have another insight into James's character out of Matthew 20 through 24. Then the mother of Zebedee's sons came to Jesus with her sons, and kneeling down, asked a favor of him. What is it you want? He asked. She said, grant that one of these two sons of mine may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. You do not know what you're asking, Jesus said to them. Can you drink the cup I'm going to drink? We can, they answered. Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup, but to sit at my right or left is not for me to grant. These places belong to those for whom they have been prepared by my Father. When the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. So here we discover that he is also a bit ambitious and overconfident. Now, Mark also records this, but doesn't mention the mother. We know from Matthew 27:56 and Mark chapter 16 that her name was Salome, one of the many women who followed Jesus caring for his needs. So she was along with her sons during Jesus' ministry. Because of the family's affluence, she could probably afford to be with Jesus for a long period of time and join her sons during this ministry. So this idea of sitting on the right and left of Jesus was undoubtedly hatched in the minds of James and John because of Jesus' promise just prior in Matthew 19. Jesus said to them, surely I tell you, at the renewal of all things, when the Son of Man sits in his glorious throne, you who have followed me will also sit on the 12 thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is evidently what was going through their minds after Jesus had said this. Well, hey, why don't we get the thrones that are closest to Jesus? That's what they wanted. Now, Mark doesn't mention James and John's mother, but I just want to bring it out to you just to show you another example of the personality, I guess, of James and John. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus replied, or he asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other on your left. we want you to do for us whatever we ask. A little tact can go a long ways in getting what you want, but apparently this wasn't required for them. They felt this close to Jesus. They were the sons of thunder, but however, they were already in the intimate company of three, okay? They probably thought of numerous reasons why they deserved this honor, so why not ask for it? Was this really a good time to be bringing this up? This is like asking your dad for the car when he just found out he's only got a week to live. Really? This would probably make them hopelessly human, just like us, right? We can sometimes have the wrong attitude. So what was Jesus' response? They clearly didn't understand what kind of baptism he meant. No concept of what cup he was asking them to drink. In their foolish ambition or their self-confidence, they assured Jesus that they were able to drink from that cup. He didn't promise them those highest thrones, but assured them that they would indeed drink of those cups. I'm sure at that moment they could not appreciate that what they had just volunteered for. So what was the other 10 apostles' response? They were indignant. This certainly created a bit of animosity and friction in the group. You can just imagine a debate continuing right up to the Last Supper. I mean, look at Luke 22. Also, and this is at the Last Supper. Also, a dispute arose among them as to which of them was considered to be the greatest. The most important event in human history is about to take place, and the disciples are still arguing about their status in the kingdom. The end of James's story on earth is recorded in Acts 12. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. He had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. When he saw that this pleased the Jews, he proceeded to seize Peter also. We notice that this is the one place in Scripture that we find James by himself. He's alone. This was not, by the way, the same Herod that had John the Baptist killed. That was Herod Antipas. This Herod was Herod Agrippa I, which was the previous Herod's nephew. So Herod saw that killing James was pleasing to the Jews, and thus began a campaign of harassment against the Christians. So James was the first to be martyred, and the only apostle whose death is actually recorded in Scripture. Clearly, James was a man of passion, and with the Holy Spirit, spread the truth to the point of arousing the wrath of Herod. History records that James's testimony bore fruit right up to the moment he was executed. In fact, I'm going to read straight out of the book of Eusebius's account. Was actually from Clement of the last days of James. Clement says that the one who led James to the judgment seat, when he saw him bearing his testimony, was moved and confessed that he himself was also a Christian. They were both, therefore, he says, led away together, and on the way he begged James to forgive him. And James, after considering a little, said, "Peace be with thee," and kissed him. and thus they were both beheaded at the same time. So even to the end, James was sharing the gospel, the love of Christ. So in the end, James learned to be more like Andrew, bringing people to Christ, instead of itching to execute people by firing rain down on them. Ultimately, his passions were tempered by sensitivity and grace. He learned to bridle his tongue and redirect his zeal and eliminate his thirst for revenge. So I think we can take that with us when we leave here today. Anytime you feel like raining fire on someone, it's not your place, first of all. Okay? So next week, we will be discussing John, and I promise you it's not going to be a rerun of this week, because John was in everything that we talked about today. But we're going to set John apart. He was the disciple of love, and we'll have lots more information about him next week. I appreciate your attention. Thank you.